Welcome. My name is Pete Moore from Case Western Reserve University. Today at the Westfield Insurance Studio Theater here at IdeaStream, we will be listening to a special City Club forum featuring Professor Sherine Hafez, Assistant Professor at the University of California, Riverside. Professor Hafez is in the Women's Studies Department at the University of California. Her interests center on women's studies in the Arab and Middle Eastern cultures. She's the author of 2 books, most recently An Islam of Her Own, Reconsidering Religion and Secularism in Women's Islamic Movements. Professor Hafez received her master's degree in anthropology from the American University of Cairo and her PhD in anthropology from the University of California at Davis. Today we are fortunate to be hearing a talk based on her research, Taking Back the Streets, Women's Activism in the Egyptian Uprising. Professor Hafez.
Thank you for this introduction, Professor Moore. Thank you also for the City Club and the Nakmas, right? So one of the longest revolutions that has yet to take place in the forefront in the struggle against oppression and political tyranny in the Arab world today is the women's rights movement. The struggle for equal rights for women in the region has become, over the last century, the single most discounted issue that relates to social injustice and subordination. An issue that is central to the lives of more than 80 million women, 180 million women in the Arab world today, has to the most degree been sidelined amidst historical struggles for freedom from colonialism, processes of nation-state building, strategies for liberalization, and more recently, the uprisings against despotic regimes. The systemic political and economic disenfranchisement of generations of Arabs whose years of political silence were fed by illusions of stability and peace has caused the naturalization of women's rights as a woman's problem, one that is theirs and not the people's. But as the world watched Egypt's brave men and women in the streets vowing to give their lives to Egypt so that Egypt should be free, many wondered if the outcome of this revolution was going to be worth the blood of the hundreds who died. Anticipation took hold as the Supreme Military Council promised constitutional reform and significant regime change. As an organization that is based on a male-centered hierarchy that reinforces dominant masculinity as an organizing principle, the military acted predictably as one of the defining forces of gender in the country. Women were nowhere to be found in the negotiations that issued between the military council and the leaders of the protests. This is despite women's efforts and sacrifices, their equal shouldering of the energies that mobilized the events behind January 25th in Egypt. Women were not consulted on proposed constitutional changes, nor were their rights considered in the proposed changes to the Constitution, despite the dire need to have women represented politically. When it came to women, quote, the silence was deafening, unquote. And health, I will turn briefly now to a few slides on PowerPoint that can best illustrate the present situation in Egypt, and particularly with regards to women and the role that they played in the uprising in Tahrir Square. So to give you sort of an overview of what has taken place in the uprising, I'm sure many of you have learned about the uprising and the so-called Arab Spring. And the timeline of events actually stretched across 18 days, beginning with January 25th, which now has become the name of the revolution. The revolution of January 25th marks the end of Mubarak's regime and the beginning of a new era in Egypt. So on the 25th, Egyptians from all walks of life, every class, every gender, every social, religious, and ethnic background marched towards Tahrir Square. This was in response to a call that was advertised on Facebook and Twitter. Demonstrations then spread all over the country. Many cities, such as Alexandria, Suez, other cities in Upper Egypt, saw demonstrations take place as more and more people decided to join the revolt. Several buildings were torched, including the National Democratic Party building. It is still actually standing very close to Tahrir, looking completely burned down. The Cairo Museum was vandalized, and police disappears from the streets in an effort from the government to show that any support of the uprising will result in incredible fear and instability in the country. On the first day, 11 people are killed, intensifying demonstrations. The death toll today is known to be about 3,000 people. Now, on February 11th, after having said that he will not rerun again, we hear that Mubarak has stepped down. The military takes over government and makes several promises, minor concessions, and observers are concerned because they're wondering what the military will do in the country. Egypt's revolt has yet to complete its mission. Just to give you an idea, about 40% of Egypt's population live at or under the poverty line, earning $2 or less per day. 22 to 40% of Egyptian households are headed by women. Hence, women has been at the forefront of the protests, constituting 50%, 20 to 50% on a given day during the demonstrations. Also, to give you an idea about the demands of the uprising and what the protesters were asking for, first demand is to end corruption and remove all Mubarak's regime supporters from power. Unfortunately, this has not happened yet. Yes, Mubarak's government has stepped down, yet Mubarak supporters are everywhere. The upcoming elections on November 28th, the former members of the National Democratic Party, the party that was supporting Mubarak, were allowed to run again in the parliamentary elections. That is, despite objections of every single political party that has decided to run in the race. The second demand is to lift emergency laws and free detainees. To this day, emergency laws are still in effect. Emergency laws allows the military council to detain anyone without reason, to court-martial them. So this is civilians are being court-martialed in military courts. And of course, as you know, in military courts, the legal system is not followed. The third demand is to rewrite the constitution to assure democratic rule. So far, only a few referendums have been modified. The constitution has yet to be rewritten. And number 4, free elections. Now, recent changes to Egypt's electoral law stipulated that 2/3 of parliament will be elected through a proportional list system and 1/3 through a single ticket voting. The first list was required to have 8 candidates. And the first candidates on the first list are the ones who are most likely to win votes. Now, SCAF, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, has eliminated women's quota from parliament. In the past, during Mubarak's reign, 64 seats were reserved for women in parliament. So this has been revoked in return for having women listed as candidates on the electoral list. So each electoral list that is comprised of 8 candidates would include 1 woman. These lists, however, like I said, are more likely to be voted for only through the beginning of the list. So basically, people who are at the bottom of the list are very less likely to be voted or have any attention paid to them. Many women have found, to their disappointment, that they have been relegated to the very bottom of each list. Now, just to give you a background about the uprising and why these events are now taking place in Egypt, I want to take you back to the 1990s, structural adjustment policies. The history actually goes beyond the 1990s, but for the sake of this talk, I'll just go back to the 1990s. Now, structural adjustment policies that were recommended by IMF and the World Bank basically advised the Egyptian government to undergo several agrarian changes, meaning laws that are attached to land reform. One of the most important change that took place in the Egyptian economy in the 1990s was to release the freeze on land rental, agrarian rural land rental. A freeze that had been placed by former government to protect the farmers was now completely eliminated, leaving the landlords to double, sometimes even quadruple, the cost of land rental. So many farmers found themselves unable to cope with this sudden increase in land rent. Many of these farmers who relied on their sons to work their land had to reduce the amount of land that they were renting. Many of these young men, now without a job, migrated to the cities. The IMF and the World Bank had intended that this would actually increase industrialization in the cities. Now that this incredible amount of labor is going to descend on the cities, this would create a boom, according to them, in the industry. However, this did not happen. There are small mercies, and the small mercy was that during that time there was a building boom in Egypt, which absorbed a lot of this labor. Once the building boom was over, many of this unskilled labor had nowhere to go. They formed shanty towns outside of cities. They dabbled with drugs, petty crime, and created a huge nuisance and pressure on the city's resources. Not to mention that with the changes in land reform, this had created an upheaval in the familiar system and the social organization of rural families. Families that subsidized on family connections, on the patriarchal system, where the family patriarch basically took care of the youth, the young men and women in his community, were now somehow demasculinized, where they could no longer support their younger family members. Their power loss was also the fragmentation of the bonds between family members in rural areas. Young men, on the other hand, found themselves completely without support. They could neither look to their parents for help, nor could they look for the state for any support. Many of these young men went to the cities hoping for jobs, only to find poverty, unemployment, and basically a lack of any governmental support. Those who actually got an education were also to be disappointed, because despite neoliberalization, the promised jobs did not materialize. Many of these young men were at the forefront of the Egyptian uprising. Now, to continue with the Egyptian context, with the breakdown of government services, we find that systems of repression, like state police and basic imprisonment of civilians without cause, also increased, absorbing a large percentage of the country's meager economy. Then a state of phantom stability presides, creating the illusion, both internally and internationally, that the regime presides over the protection of the region from extremist Islamic trends. So as long as the government created this fiction that everything was stable, everything was good, and as long as Islamist groups were under control, those governments seemed to be, quote-unquote, successful. And thus they received a lot of international aid and international support. Now, women, as I had mentioned before, comprised 22 to 50% of Egyptian households. They had these households, having to be the only supporter of their children, of their families. These women found themselves also without support after the structural adjustment policies of 1990. And as I said before, they comprised 20 to 50% of the demonstrators in Tahrir Square. Unfortunately, despite the fact that many of these women struggled to survive, they had no political or very little political participation. As many as 92.6% of women were not registered to vote in a survey conducted in 2004. 92.6%. Now, 38% of registered voters are women, which reflects a fair leap forward for them. Yet, what is the importance, I ask, of voting when women's rights are not on the political agenda and when the larger socio-political order makes little or no effort to include women with men as equals in building the future of this country? Now, despite the fact that they have formed such a small percentage of the electoral body, they still have been involved in several forms of activism, which I will focus on now. I want to begin with the women's labor movement, or women's labor activism, because I believe that women's involvement in the labor movement in Egypt has been the impetus behind the uprising and the success of the revolution in Egypt. Let me give you a few examples. On the 7th of December 2006, 3,000 women garment workers went on strike to demand promised government bonuses. They basically marched into the factory areas designated for male workers, chanting, "Here we are the women, where are the men?" The chant was supposed to shame men into action since their masculinity depended on it. And it worked. The men followed them, and the results of the strikes were incredible. The labor movement in Egypt is one of the core forces, as I mentioned, that triggered the events leading to the success of the revolution of 2011. It's continuing to this day. Another form of activism that women have been involved in, which I have been researching for the last 10 years in Egypt, is women's Islamic activism. Women are involved in organizations to promote social welfare and empower women all over the country. These organizations do not seek an Islamist government, nor are they to be understood as merely concerned with religious ritual either. In fact, the social reform projects that many of these women practice and undergo in the country are essentially modern in practice and secular in disposition. And just to give you an idea that feminism is alive and well in Egypt, in the Arab world as a whole, let me give you just a little run through the history of feminist activism in Egypt. So in 1919, the Egyptian nationalist revolution took place in Egypt. Women participated in that revolution in huge numbers. And this was also because they were calling for the removal of the British. Egypt was occupied by the British at that time. Hoda Sha'rawi, whose picture you see here at the bottom left, was a pioneer feminist and political activist. She was the founder of the Egyptian Feminist Union in 1923. Interestingly, the Egyptian Feminist Union was dismantled at some point in Egyptian history. Nowadays, however, the EFU has been resuscitated, and it has now included about 1,500 other feminist organizations in Egypt, where women are now organizing to call for their rights in this new government that's going to take place in the country. Post-World War II, the Egyptian women's movement became more radical, including younger voices. A younger generation of Egyptian women started to call for equality, started to call for rights, and this movement continues today. And again, as I mentioned, women have been at the helm of the uprising in Egypt. Talking about the uprisal, I just want to give you a few examples of women who have played a very central role to mobilize and sustain the revolts in Tahrir Square. The first person I want to talk about, the first woman I want to talk about is Sally Zahran. Sally Zahran was 20 years old. She was killed by Mubarak thugs when she was struck by a gun or a heavy instrument to her head. She went home, went to sleep, and never woke up. Ghada Shahbandar, whose picture you see at the bottom left, is another activist with the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights. She is currently a professor of English, and she's also a mother of 4. Isra Abdel Fattah, whose picture you see here at the top right, is 27 years old. In 2008, Abdel Fattah tried to mobilize all of Egypt around labor conditions in Al-Mahalla Kubra, which is a city that's dedicated to the manufacture of fabrics and cloth. The male workers in the industrial town constituted the majority of the original protesters, and Isra had been relentless in trying to organize these labor movements. She was arrested, however, for about 18 days and imprisoned. And after numerous attempts by her parents to get her released, the government relented, and when she was released, she made a public promise never to be involved in activism again. We have not heard much from Isra since then. Asma Mahfouz, however, is 26 years old. She is a member of the April 6th youth movement, and she is a young, incredibly active, dynamic, outspoken woman who single-handedly mobilized thousands of people to show up in Tahrir on January 25th. And I will just let Isra show you what she's made of.
من الذل ومن الجوع ومن الفقر ومن البهدله اللي شايفينها بقالهم 30 سنه. 4 من المصريين ولعوا في نفسهم، قالوا يمكن يحصل زي اللي حصل في تونس، يمكن نبقى بلد حرة، بلد فيها عدل، بلد فيها كرامة، بلد الإنسان فيها إنسان بجد، مش عايش كحيوان. النهارده واحد منهم مات وأعلنوا موته. لقيت كل الناس واقفة بتقول لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله، ده مات كافر، ده مات عايز شهرة. يا جماعة حرام عليكم. أنا نزلت وكتبت إن أنا بنت وهنزل ميدان التحرير وهقف لوحدي وهرفع يافطة يمكن الناس تحس، وكتبت رقم يمكن الناس تنزل. محدش نزل إلا 3 شباب، محدش نزل إلا 3 شباب و3 عربيات أمن مركزي، وكان الباقي جاي في السكة، وعشرات من البلطجية وظباط، وكانوا جايين بمنتهى الرعب. فضلوا يتكلموا معانا، بعدونا عن الناس يمكن بأسوأ شوية، بس أول لما انفردوا بينا قعدوا يقولوا لنا حرام عليكم، كفاية، احنا منكم، احنا من الشعب. الناس اللي ماتوا دول عندهم حالة نفسية، حالة نفسية حرام بقى، كفاية اللي بيحصل ده، كفاية. كل الجرايد وكل حاجة تبع الحكومة، اي حد بيموت من البهدلة والقرف اللي احنا عايشين فيه يتقال ان هو مات كده علشان عنده اختلال ولا مشكلة نفسية. مشكلة نفسية يروح عند مجلس الشعب. انا بس بصور لكم فيديو عشان اقول لكم رسالة واحدة، عايزين ننزل يوم 25. لو لسه عندنا كرامة ولسه عايزين نعيش كإنسان وكبني آدمين في البلد دي، لازم ننزل يوم 25. هننزل نطالب بحقنا كبني آدمين. مش هقول لكم حقنا كسياسيين ولا عايزين ولا مجلس الشعب ولا رئيس ولا أي زفت من الكلام ده كله. عايزين حقنا، مش عايزين أي حاجة تانية. الحكومة دي كلها بقت بايظة، رئيس فاسد والدنيا بايظة وأمن دولة بايظ. الناس دي ما خافوش من الموت وخافوا من أمن الدولة، خافوا من الفساد. تخيلوا انتوا برضه انتوا كده هتموتوا نفسكم ولا انتوا مش درانين؟ انا هنزل يوم 25 من دلوقتي لحد 25 هنزل اوزع بيان على كل واحد في الشارع، ومش هولع في نفسي. لو الحكومة عايزة تولع فيا تيجي تولع، وكل واحد في البلد دي شايف نفسه راجل يبقى ينزل. ما كل واحد في البلد دي بيقول البنات اللي بتنزل مظاهرة بتتبهدل وما يصحش ان هي تنزل، وحرام يخلي عنده نخوة ورجولة وينزل يوم 25. كل واحد بيقول العدد هيبقى نازل قليل ومفيش حاجة هتحصل. عايز اقول له انت السبب في اللي احنا فيه. ايوه انت السبب، وانت مدان زيك زي الرئيس، زي اي فاسد، زي اي ضابط بيضربنا وبيبهدلنا. انت السبب. نزولك معانا هيفرق، ومش بيفرق حاجة بسيطة، لا بيفرق كتير. كلامك مع جيرانك ومع صحابك ومع زمايلك ومع اهلك، وانك تشجعهم ان هم ينزلوا. حتى لو هتنزلوا في منطقة مش في ميدان التحرير ولا قدام اللازوغلي ولا في اي حته، بس تنزلوا تسجلوا موقف وتقولوا احنا بني ادمين، ده بيفرق. قعدك في بيتك بتتفرج او بتشوف على الفيسبوك وبتتابع الاخبار، ده بيبهدلنا احنا، بيبهدلنا انا. لو انت عندك كرامه وانت انسان وراجل في البلد دي، يبقى تنزل تحميني وتحمي اي بنت نازله. لو فضلت قاعد في البيت تبقى تستحق كل اللي بيجرالك، ومش انت لوحدك. انت هتبقى مدان، انت هتبقى مسؤول، وانت اللي عليك ذنب كبير قوي، ذنب البلد دي وذنب كل واحد عايش فيها. انت هتبقى شايل مسؤولية كل واحد نزل الشارع عشان يطالب بحقه وانت قاعد في بيتك. انزل البيت، ابعت مسجات لاصحابك، اكتب على النت في كل حتة، وعي. انت عارف الدايرة بتاعتك، عمارتك لوحدها واصحابك وقرايبك، بس قول لهم انزل معايا. نزلهم 5 ولا 10، لو كل واحد فينا نزل 5 و10 ونزل بيهم لميدان التحرير او ميدان اللازوغلي او في اي حته عشوائيه حتى، ويتكلم الناس ويقول لهم بقى كفايه، بدل ما نولع في نفسنا تعالوا نتكلم ونسجل موقف، ده هيفرق وهيفرق كتير قوي. اوعى تقول مفيش امل. طول ما انت بتقول مفيش امل هيبقى مفيش امل. طول ما انت بتنزل وبتسجل موقف هيبقى فيه امل. اوعى تخاف من الحكومه، خاف من ربنا. ربنا بيقول ان الله لا يغير ما بنفس حتى بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بانفسهم. ليه؟ مش علشان ان انت تبقى كويس وقاعد في حالك وماشي جنب الحيط، الحيطه هتقع عليك وهتقع علينا كلنا. انزل وطالب بحقك وبحقي وبحق اهلك وبحقنا كلنا. انا نازله يوم 25 وهقول للفساد لا والنظام لا.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Asma Mahfouz, one of the most important persons in the Egyptian uprising in Egypt of January 25th, 2011. I'm going to give her a big hand. So what is happening now? The post-demonstrations have post-demonstrations, what is happening now? Demonstrations have took place. They are still happening sporadically. People occupy Tahrir all the time. We hear about, more and more uprisings, objections to what's happening to the country. The elections are taking place. The emergency law is still in effect. So there's a lot of unease. There's a lot of insecurity. There's a lot of tension. Unfortunately, the largest tension that I can see is the tension that surrounds women and women's position in the uprising and women's rights in the country. After the efforts that you have seen, after the incredible, consistent activism, the consistent sacrifice, women like Asma Mahfouz, young women, put their lives on the line. This was a time, by the way, the video that she composed was at a time when the government was arresting people left and right. She went on YouTube, said what her name was, where she worked, invited people to be there, used every single persuasive argument, including also, again, obligating men to their masculinity, claiming Islam as a way to change society, trying to put herself, her own safety on the line, basically saying, if you think that girls go to Tahrir and these demonstrations to be harassed and humiliated, come and protect us. So obligating the patriarchal bargain that obligates, the masculinity in the Arab world. So this young woman is just one of thousands of young people who have placed their lives on hold just so that Egypt can be free. At this point, unfortunately, we have not seen much improvement when it comes to the rights of women. Women, like I mentioned, were not included in the constitutional referendums. They were not consulted with any political changes. Their numbers have dwindled from parliament, and like I explained before, in terms of the next parliamentary elections, they are not going to have equal opportunity to be nominated or elected. The list goes on and on and on. Yet they have not given up. As you can see in these pictures, women continue to make a difference in Tahrir and outside of Tahrir. The woman that you see here at the bottom left is Busaina Kamal. She's Egypt's first woman presidential candidate. And she hopes to change, to have social change, she hopes to change people's perception just by being out there. And here's what she says, quote, "No one expected the revolution would topple Mubarak, but it happened. We can win, but even if we don't, we are winning every day just by being out there, changing people's perspectives." And that, in a nutshell, is what women activists are hoping to do in Egypt. Change by being out there. Changing perceptions, waning patriarchal ideologies, and doing politics. A strategy that Egypt's first female judge and the vice president of the Supreme Constitutional Court, Tahani Gebali, seems to endorse. And I will end with her quote, "Women should not wait to be invited. It is time for them to perform their rights," unquote. Thank you.
Today at the Westfield Insurance Studio Theater here at IdeaStream, we are listening to a special City Club forum featuring Sherine Hafez, assistant professor at the University of California, Riverside. We will return to our speaker in a minute for the traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ PBS, IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. In 2012, the City Club of Cleveland will turn 100 years old. We are planning a number of events throughout the year and look forward to celebrating with our community. For more information about our upcoming forums, please refer to the back of your program or to our website, cityclub.org, and learn more about the 100th anniversary events. Visit the 100th anniversary tab on our website. Now, we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Please move to the microphone on your right, go up around, and we will take questions. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
How would you compare and contrast the current U.S. uprising to the Egyptian uprising and the role of women in this movement?
Well, I have to say that a lot of us in Egypt were very surprised when a lot of the uprisings started to appear here, and people were claiming squares and claiming, spaces. And I feel that there's a lot of similarity between what's happening here and what's happening in Egypt and what's happening in the Arab world, to the point where I think that there are bonds and connections between people that have now transcended the boundaries of national boundaries. I don't know if any of you have heard, but when demonstrations started out I think it was where was it when it first started, and Egyptian demonstrators sent pizza over. So those shows of solidarity, I think that there is an incredible movement that is sweeping across the world. To be very honest with you, I see that there are bonds, there are very similar demands. I feel that perhaps the demonstrations in Egypt in particular have been more diverse than the demonstrations here. They're more cross class, cross age, gender, etc. Yet I see a lot of similarities between both movements, definitely. Minnesota, when it was in Minnesota. Yeah.
A Yemenis woman won the Nobel Prize for Peace for her protests in Yemen against the government. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this award and what impact it has had on the region. Any repercussions?
Ms. Karman in Yemen is one of the leaders of the activist movement, of the women's activist movement. She's also a very popular leader across genders as well. I mean, I've seen footage of Ms. Karman on YouTube and Al Jazeera showing, the incredible following that she enjoys in Yemen and the incredible sustenance. I mean, she has given to that, revolt in Yemen. And I also heard that the president of Yemen has stepped down today, which means that, this really coronates her efforts, quite successfully. She actually gave an interview, I think, to Al Jazeera, where she said that the award basically announced the end of the government. That to her, she's seen people step down in other governments, but in Yemen, it seems that the president had stepped down a long time ago. So Karman, to me, epitomizes the Arab activist woman beyond any example that I can even give today. And there are so many women like her as well all over the Arab world.
You gave a lot of background, but you didn't talk about what the solutions are. Could you explain further, not only just in Egypt, but around the Muslim world, how the women movement can incorporate in the political structure?
Okay, I think that this is a question that we have to ask of the Egyptian people. And I think that the time has now come for doing and not talking about, theoretical solutions to everything. What is happening in Egypt has been a natural outcome of years of oppression and political subordination, not just of women, but of men as well. And I believe wholeheartedly that it is up to the Egyptian people now to decide how to move forward. And it's up to the Egyptian women to also decide how to be part of the new government. And as I ended my talk, I said that it's time for women to do politics and not just talk about it. So I'm not going to contradict that by now giving, these abstract theoretical solutions for a very complex situation. I'm sorry, I didn't really answer your questions, but I'm very hopeful.
I thought it was very interesting how you commented on structures within the Egyptian culture that already included women, like labor, social organizations within Muslim religious groups, and some of the human rights groups. Can you go into a little more detail about what parts of the culture they're in, or organizations, like are there other industries that are organized other than garment workers where women are particularly influential or could be, and in the church or in other ways, and are they the structures that could lead to more political involvement, or are they likely to stay apolitical because that's the nature of the culture and the people? What do you think on those kind of issues, really?
Let me start from where you ended. You know, is there a way for this to change? And I think that women's role in the uprising has been not only documented, but has been etched in their memory forever. The participation that women have shown in the uprising will never change. This is a moment that is now has become actually a turning point in women's, feminist history in the country. And I feel that it can never be erased. So it's a moment of mobilization. It's a moment of change. And as you mentioned, and as I mentioned, I did not elaborate in great detail, because of the time constraints. But women have been and continue to be active in many, many different organizations in Egypt, not just in the labor movement. They've been active in the syndicates, for example. They've been very active in unions. But unfortunately, under the former regimes, unions have been co-opted by the state. So I am hoping that in the future, with the liberalization of politics in Egypt and with, more opportunities for women to participate openly and politically, to actually be able to have a voice in the political decision making in the country, that would also be a wonderful outcome for their, centuries-old efforts in the country. As far as, this point that you raised, which I think is really important, that women have and continue to be a very integral part of activism in the country. They have been also, very active religiously. And that is, something, that many people maybe think is almost like a false consciousness on their part, that maybe religion oppresses them, and here they are supporting religion, so they'll never be empowered religiously. And my work has shown that, women are empowered through religious activism because it is social change. It is a form of social change that women participate in and embrace wholeheartedly. So they have been visible, and I think the critical point at this time is to be more visible, to actually change people's perceptions, because I think that's very important before we leap forward.
I wonder if you can talk about the contagion effect in the Arab Spring, and if there has been a role for women. Did the women, for example, in Syria, in Tunisia, learn from each other? Did the women in Egypt learn from the women in Tunisia? Was there any contact? So I guess my question is, has this contagion effect, if you will, affected women's movements and women's rights in the Middle East?
That's a great question too, because I feel that I think that this is a turning point in history. It's not just a turning point in Arab history, I think it's a turning point in world history. And the element of contagion does hold some negativity, but I do feel that it's more like an inspiration. And I think that women have seen what other women have been doing, and they, decide to emulate. I mean, Bahrain, women actually went out to the streets and formed their own encampments. So women participate in ways that are acceptable to their own cultures and their own values. In Egypt, perhaps because of women's feminist history, women found a way, to participate because that actually fits with their history in that particular context. Women in other areas of the Middle East, such as in Iran, for example, have been out in demonstrations, have been equally participating in revolts, in uprisings. In Tunisia, same thing. Women have been, part and parcel of the movement there. So definitely there is, a wonderful way in which people are inspired just by seeing other women out there. And I have to thank the media for having, done such a wonderful job of covering, the participation of women in these uprisings, because I think that having their picture out there, the incredible, wonderful activism they've been involved in, the selflessness of their activism has been very inspiring, even to myself. So thank you for that question.
I would like to thank you for this informative presentation. And I'm going to take a different look at this. I believe in order for women to be able to fully participate in the political process, they need to be well educated. And all the statistics we read about education of women and young girls in Egypt show that it's a very low percentage. Are you aware of any efforts from women organizations to increase that percentage and work towards that?
And thank you for that question too, because I think that education plays a central role in mobilizing people, and it's very difficult for people without a solid education to actually make wise choices. But again, I want to caution us before starting to walk down that argument, or walk down that path, because I believe that even if you're not educated, you can be politically mobilized in a way that you can express your agency. And just because women are not educated today, I know there are efforts, continuous efforts, to increase the percentages of women who are educated, but I'm just saying that it is important not to see that lack of education as an impediment to political participation. That women need to be aware of what they stand to gain and what they stand to lose by not participating. And even if they're not fully educated, they need to still be invited to participate and actually be out there and vote.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. I'd like to know, though, in watching the unrest that was taking place, it seems to me that there were a number of rapes and beatings of women, and I'm wondering whether men still have the feeling, and whether it's coming from their religious rights or they're just monopolizing their opportunity to feel that women should do exactly and live exactly as they want them to, and whether this is why so many women are divorced, and is divorce now legal, and what happens to these women when they are in single households? What happens to their children? How do they raise them? How do they take care of them? How do they get jobs? What kind of social network is there? In other words, I'd like the practical aspect of what it's like to live as a woman in Egypt.
That's a huge question. I'll do my best. I'm also, I'd like to even start by cautioning and maybe asking you where you heard about the rapes and the beatings that women have been subjected to during the uprising.
It seemed to me that it was in the news.
I would beg to differ, because during the revolution, the 18 days of the revolution, there was only one incident that was publicized in the Western media, which was the Logan case. And I would like to elaborate a little bit on that. I actually spoke yesterday a little bit about that as well. But women have reported no rapes, no attacks whatsoever during the uprising in Tahrir. In fact, women were sleeping on the floor of Tahrir night after night. As you saw some of the slides that I showed you, there were young girls there. There were young children with their families, in Tahrir, and not a single report of harassment or attack had been made. So again, we have to be careful with what the media reports, because often, media is also driven by commercialism. They really stand to gain and to profit from people reading their press. And it's very important for us to be very discerning. I'm sure you are. And that's why I asked you where you read this information. The Logan case in particular, Logan, I think a lot of you have heard of that case. It was a horrendous case. This woman was sexually abused in Tahrir by a group of thugs who were known to be pro-Mubarak thugs who were hired. See, a lot of this happened during the uprising. There are, and still happening today, there are various constituents who are representing subversive political trends in the country that are either driven by greed or personal gain to create mayhem. And it's very important for us to understand that this is happening, because these events are designed to undermine the movement towards freedom and fight against oppression of the Egyptian people. So the Logan case, she was targeted by these groups of thugs and separated from her crew, unlike other people who were also attacked. I think several reporters also from CNN and other channels reported that they were punched in the face and that they were attacked in Tahrir. Logan was unfortunately completely separated from her group, and so they sexually harassed her in Tahrir just to undermine the movement for freedom on behalf of the Egyptians. So that's one point that I wanted to touch upon. Second point I think you raised is about women. How do they fend for themselves and what sort of organizations help them? There are various organizations in Egypt that help women. As I mentioned, about 1,500 organizations all over the country that help women. However, it's not enough. And a lot of effort needs to happen. Their NGOs are placed under very strict rules by the government. SCAF has placed even more restrictive rules about NGOs receiving any funding. And so there's a lot of effort that women have to be involved in order to support female-headed households. The government, unfortunately, is not particularly supportive at this point, and I think that many of the demands that women have had have been met with, oh, not now, things have to calm down, we should have stability in the country first, which is a very common kind of argument that women have been listening to for many years. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that needs to happen to support these women.
In the United States, we see that there's a huge issue with the way that women are sexually objectified in the media. How does that translate with Egyptian pop culture media?
In pop culture in Egypt?
Yeah.
I think women also object to that in Egypt. There are many film stars in Egypt whose bodies are objectified, and if you drive through Cairo, you'll see billboards of young, attractive females, selling everything from cars to soda drinks. So it's not as rampant, though. It's not as common in Egypt to see this kind of objectification. In fact, veiling, for example, is one of the ways that women. One of the practices that women adopt in order to avoid being objectified by men. And the fact that, even here in the United States, many Muslim women decide to wear the veil because they feel that this is their response to the male gaze, to not being objectified by the male gaze. So yes, women are objectified in the media, but not to the same extent here in the United States. And women don't accept that. They reject that entirely.
I was wondering if you could comment on the institution of marriage in the Egyptian society and the Middle East at large, and specifically whether you think that the practice of taking multiple wives and polygamy as it's culturally accepted, whether that creates tension with the advancements of the role of women in Egyptian society and Middle Eastern society at large.
Okay, let me start by maybe addressing the point that you raised about multiple wives. There are only 2% of men in the Muslim world who take multiple wives. Just to give you an idea, it is not as common as people claim it to be. In fact, it is not even endorsed by religion. In fact, the verse that stipulates that men have the right to marry more than one woman and that they would never be just actually is meant to discourage men from taking more than one wife and not to enable them. However, the interpretation of Quranic verses has been, unfortunately, in the hands of males over centuries. And so, I'm sure that you can understand that when they interpret the verses, they interpret them to favor their own gender. So this is changing, however, and women are now claiming the interpretation of the Quran. And in many areas of the Arab world, women realize that these are limitations and not a free license for men to marry more than one woman. I'm not sure what you want me to talk about when it comes to marriage.
Whether you thought there was tension there as far as, culturally, whether it created a problem, this unique problem, whether it created a unique problem for women in society. The fact that it's only 2%, that's telling to me that it's not nearly as widespread as I thought it was. So that's,
Yeah, I mean, nuclear marriage is, a form of marriage around the world. Of course, it takes different shapes according to the culture. It does place limitations on both genders. It can be an enabling force for women. For example, if I can take the recipient of the Peace Nobel Prize in Yemen, Ms. Karman is married, has, I think, 3 children, and that did not deter her from setting up camp in front of the Yemeni government for months. So it does happen that some husbands may, object to their wives doing this or that, but it happens all over the world and not specifically in the Arab world.
I have a 2-part question involving the military.
Okay.
In this country, in the last 2 generations, we've seen breathtaking changes in the role of women in uniform, rising to high ranks. Do you see any, let's say, infiltration of the military by women in Egypt? The second part of my question is, I believe in order to have a freer, more just society, you cannot have the military ruling the country. Mm-hmm. How do you see the transformation?
Great questions. First of all, I'm not sure that women's participation in the American military have been breathtaking. I will have to disagree with you. I do know that women do participate in the military to some extent. However, they are not included in all aspects of the military, even in the U.S. Women are not included in the military in Egypt yet. And the transition from military rule to civilian rule has to happen, must happen. Everybody's waiting to see what is going to happen in the next parliamentary elections and the presidential elections in next year. SCAF has announced repeatedly that it will step down right before the presidential elections and ensure that the elections be, equitable and fair. So we just have to keep our fingers crossed and make sure that they are accountable to what they promise.
Thank you for a very interesting, speech.
Thank you.
By birth, I'm a Chinese, and by choice, I'm an American, and by marriage, I'm an Iranian. And I am an executive in international trade. I travel globally. Mm-hmm. 2 years ago, I traveled to Iran, and I met a group of young girls. They asked me to promote the world peace and to promote the peace between the countries. So I said, yes, I will. Mm-hmm. But my question to you is really, how can I get involved? And how can more people to join this effort? Thank you.
Thank you. And I really applaud you for your dedication to world peace and to women's issues. I think one of the best ways to be involved is to raise awareness and to really understand the issues well. And not just read the papers or, surf the internet every now and then, but to really understand the context, to really understand the history behind these uprisings in the Arab world, to understand the history of feminism in the Arab world, the rights of women, what women need to do. I think by raising awareness, at least about the perception that people have about women in the Arab world, at least you can be making a difference. You can be changing people's perception about this so-called oppressed Muslim Arab woman who just stays home, and gets beaten by her husband every time he feels like it. If you can possibly really start reading about this and start, getting interested in pursuing knowledge about the ways other cultures live and the ways other women deal with gender relations, I think that you would be doing a great service to humanity.
Is there any website and
yes,
any organizations
I mentioned,
you can introduce to? And because I belong to a diversity club in Cleveland, we bring the awareness of the different races, the different cultures, different background, how to work together. So is there any this kind of,
There are various websites. Every single organization that I mentioned today has a website. You can go to the Egyptian Feminist Union. I think that they have a website that they just created. If you just Google some of the names that I mentioned today, they also have websites and they have organizations that they support. So that would be...
Thank you. By way of conclusion, let me just briefly note that unfortunately, we don't have pizza delivered from Egypt, but we do have a small reception outside that you're all welcome to. Today at the Westfield Insurance Studio, we have been listening to a City Club forum featuring Professor Sherine Hafez. Thank you, Professor Hafez. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.